What if the British never actually colonized India? Imagine a world where the British Empire never set foot in India as colonizers. No East India Company domination, no Raj, no partition under their rule. India, often called the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, was not just a colony. It was central to Britain's wealth, global influence, and even its industrial revolution. But what if history had unfolded differently? What if India remained free of British colonial control? In this video, we dive into this alternate history. We'll explore India's political future, its economy, society, culture, science, and even the ripple effects across Europe, Asia, and the world. India, before the British. Before British colonization, India wasn't a single unified state. Instead, it was a mosaic of kingdoms, empires, and trading states. The Mughal Empire still wielded influence in the early 1700s, but its power was fading. Regional powers like the Marathas, Mysore under Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, the Sikh Confederacy, and others were on the rise. Meanwhile, European traders, Portuguese, Dutch, French, and the British East India Company were competing fiercely for influence. But in our scenario, let's imagine the British never managed to establish dominance. Maybe the East India Company was defeated decisively by Indian rulers, or maybe Britain focused entirely on the Caribbean and Africa instead of Asia. In this alternate history, India remains free from direct British conquest. The political future of India. Without British colonization, what political shape would India take? One possibility is that the Mughal Empire might have continued to decline, eventually fragmenting into strong regional states. The Marathas, with their vast influence, could have expanded further and perhaps created a confederacy resembling a proto-federal India. The Sikh Empire might have flourished in the north, controlling Punjab and beyond. Mysore, with its strong military and modernizing tendencies under Tipu Sultan, could have built a southern powerhouse. Over time, these states might have competed, allied, and clashed, similar to how Europe evolved after the fall of the Roman Empire. Instead of a single India under one empire, the subcontinent may have looked more like a federation of independent but interconnected kingdoms. And who knows? The pressure of European trade powers might even have pushed Indian rulers to unite faster, forming an early pan-Indian identity to resist outsiders. The economy. A very different industrial revolution. Before colonization, India was not a poor land. In fact, it was one of the world's richest regions. Its textiles, spices, gems, and crafts were highly sought after globally. In 1700, India accounted for nearly 25% of the world's GDP. British colonization reversed this wealth dramatically. Through heavy taxation, destruction of local industries, and exploitation of resources, India's share of global GDP fell to under 5% by the time the British left. Famines ravaged millions because of colonial economic policies. But in our alternate history, without British control, India's economy could have taken a very different path. Indian artisans and textile producers might have continued dominating world markets. Indian shipbuilders, traders, and merchants could have remained major global players. There's also the question of industrialization. Would India have industrialized on its own? Some historians believe yes, India had iron production, advanced agriculture, and thriving urban centers. With global trade bringing in new technologies, Indian states might have embraced machines and factories on their own terms, without having their industries destroyed by colonial imports. In this world, we might have seen an Indian Industrial Revolution, with Indian textiles, steel, and shipping competing head-to-head with Britain, France, and later, the United States. Society and culture. Colonial rule imposed a rigid hierarchy, disrupted traditional systems, and fueled divides. The British implemented divide and rule, deepening religious and caste differences for political advantage. Without British colonization, Indian society would have evolved differently. Social reform might still have come, but led by Indians themselves rather than colonial rulers. For example, abolition of practices like sati or child marriage could still have occurred through Indian reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, but on their own timeline. The caste system may have modernized more naturally, influenced by urbanization and local reform movements rather than British interference. Education systems might have expanded in traditional and modern forms: Sanskrit schools, Persian learning, and emerging universities blending Indian and global sciences. And culturally, India's traditions in literature, art, architecture and philosophy could have continued uninterrupted, without the colonial lens reshaping them for European consumption. Science and technology. One overlooked impact of British colonization is the suppression of indigenous science. For centuries, India had excelled in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and metallurgy. Without colonization, this scientific tradition might have developed further. For example, Indian metallurgists had already mastered advanced steel making. Wootz steel was famous worldwide. Indian mathematicians had pioneered concepts like zero and trigonometry. Imagine if these traditions had continued evolving with global exchanges of knowledge instead of being overshadowed by European dominance. We could have seen Indian universities and research centres flourishing, producing their own Newtons, Darwins and Einsteins in parallel with Europe. Religion and unity. One of the most lasting scars of British rule was the partition of India in 1947, which split the subcontinent into India and Pakistan, later Bangladesh. This partition displaced millions and triggered violence that killed up to 1 million people. Without British colonization, would partition have happened? Possibly not. While Hindu-Muslim tensions existed, they were not insurmountable. Indian states like the Mughals and Marathas often had mixed administrations. The British, however, institutionalized these divides, creating separate electorates and fostering mistrust. In an alternate history, the subcontinent might have evolved toward a more inclusive political identity, either as a single federation or as a collection of cooperative states. While tensions would still exist, the catastrophic partition might never have occurred. Global ripple effects. Now let's widen our view. If India wasn't colonized, how would this have changed world history? For Britain, without Indian wealth, Britain might not have become the global superpower it did. The Industrial Revolution would have been slower without cheap Indian cotton feeding British mills. Britain's empire would have been smaller, and perhaps rival powers like France or Spain might have gained an edge. For Asia, India might have been a powerful counterweight to European expansion in Asia. Its trade networks with Southeast Asia, the Middle East and Africa could have reshaped global geopolitics. For the world wars, without British India, Britain would have struggled in both world wars. Indian soldiers played a massive role in Britain's victories. Millions fought in Europe, Africa and Asia. Without this manpower, Britain might have lost earlier, or at least emerged much weaker. For decolonization, India's freedom struggle inspired independence movements worldwide. If India was never colonized, perhaps the global wave of decolonization would have taken a different path, or come much later. The modern world without British colonization. So what would a modern India look like in this alternate history? We might see multiple powerful Indian states, or perhaps a federal union, similar to the European Union. Economically, India could be one of the world's richest regions, perhaps even rivaling China as a global manufacturing and innovation hub. Culturally, Indian languages, films and traditions would have spread even more widely, not filtered through colonial narratives. Politically, India could have been a major world power centuries earlier, shaping global institutions and trade. And most importantly, millions of lives lost in colonial famines, forced labour and partition violence might have been spared. The flip side. Could colonization have been replaced by something else? Of course, we should also consider that if the British didn't colonize India, another power might have. The French were strong contenders in the 18th century. The Portuguese already had Goa and trading posts. Even local empires might have expanded aggressively. So while India might not have been colonized by Britain, it's possible some other empire would have imposed control. The difference is, the British had a uniquely global empire that drained India's resources on a massive scale. Perhaps no other colonizer would have reshaped India so profoundly. Conclusion: the world that could have been. In the end, imagining an India never colonized by Britain is imagining a very different world. India might have remained one of the richest, most innovative regions on Earth. The global balance of power would have shifted, perhaps preventing the British Empire from dominating the 19th century. The tragedy of partition, the famines of colonial rule, and the suppression of Indian industry might never have happened. Instead, we could be living in a world where India was a global leader centuries earlier, shaping technology, politics, and culture on its own terms. History, however, took another path. Colonization left deep scars, but it also left lessons. And perhaps the greatest of these is to recognize what was lost so we can better appreciate the resilience and achievements of India today. So, what do you think? If India had never been colonized, would it have become a united superpower or a collection of smaller but powerful kingdoms? Would Britain have still become a global empire without India's wealth? And how different would our modern world look? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into alternate history.